another lightning round. Today, we're talking about closures. Everybody loves closures, right? Yes. Yes, we do. Let's start out by defining a closure. So here we will define a closure. We'll start out with a constant, name it add. Our closure will basically be adding two integers or two doubles here. So we have a first double, first argument, a second double. So our closure will be expecting two parameters or two arguments of type double. And our closure is returning a double. So far, so good. And here we are using closure syntax, open curly bracket, close curly bracket, and we'll go ahead and define the structure of our closure. So we have a num1 and a num2 and the in keyword. So here we have the basic structure of a closure. In that case, let's not forget our parens here. Great. So we have our parameter list, we have our return type, and we have our closure definition here. In our closure definition, we will return the result of the addition of the two doubles. Right? So here we simply return num1 plus num2. So far, so good. Great. So now we have our closure. If we option click on our add constant name, we see we have a closure here. We have two doubles, our return arrow, followed by a double. So our closure takes in two arguments of type double and returns the result as a double. So far, so good. Great. Now let's go ahead and call our add closure. Here, we will define a constant to capture the result of our add value. We'll use add as the name of the closure. Again, it expects two arguments. I'll pass in 10 and 5, right? So here we have 10 and we have 5. Since we said we are adding doubles, I could pass in 10.5, pass in 5.2 here. Those are valid for my closure. Takes in two doubles. Here, two double parameters. My first argument, my second argument, my first parameter, my second parameter, and my return type double. Result here is type double. Everything is great. Let's go ahead and print result 1. I'll run playgrounds. And indeed, 10.5 plus 5.2 is 15.7. Great. So here we've seen defining a closure. Lines 6 to 9 is the definition of the closure. Lines 12 is basically using that defined closure. So here we are call our add closure. So call and execute our add closure. Great. So far, so good. So let's move on to defining a function that takes a closure. So here we'll define a function that takes a closure. Cool. So we'll start out with the func keyword. It's a function. Again, closures of functions, slight differences. Later, we'll see the differences between closures and functions. For now, we could pass closures around like we pass variables. They're known as first-class citizens. We could return a closure. We could pass a closure into a function. And here we saw we could define a closure and put it into a variable or a constant in that case. Great. So let's continue. So we have perform, that's the name of our function. Perform operation. So perform operation, what's its parameters? So perform operation takes in a double, takes in two doubles. We'll call it num1, num2. Great. It also takes in an operation closure. First parameter is a double, second parameter is a double, and it returns the result as a double. All right? So here we have our function called perform operation. First parameter is a double. Second parameter is also a double here. And the third parameter is a closure, right? So here we have our closure. It's called operation. And our closure has two double parameters and a double return type. And our function itself returns a double. Great. So here is our function definition. Let's go ahead and do the function body. All right? Our function body basically will call operation. Operation expects two arguments, num1 and num2 in this case. So num1 and num2 will be passed into our function, right? Our function expects num1, num2, right? So num1, num2, we use it in our operation closure. Our operation closure here, right, expects two doubles. So we have satisfied our operation closure by passing it two doubles. Great. So far, so good. Let's go on to calling our function perform operation, right, using a predefined closure, right? When we say predefined closure here, we're talking about a closure we've defined before. In that case, we've defined the add closure. So we could go ahead and use it now. So let's see how that looks. So here we'll have a result2. We'll call our perform operation. It expects two values. I'll pass in 5 and 6. And it also expects a closure. And here we pass our closure as add. Right? So far, so good. So here we have our function. It's called perform operation. We have the first argument, a double. We're passing 5. Let's pass in 5.4. And our second argument, we have 6. We could pass in 6.3. Again, those are doubles. Our function expects doubles. That's valid. It also expects a third argument, a closure. Add is a closure. If we option click on add, we see it's a closure here, right? It has two doubles for the parameters and it returns a double. So great, the function is done at this point. Function call is done. We'll go ahead and print our result2, right? And let's see what we get, right? Great, so here the result of adding 5.4 and 6.3 was 11.7, right? The second operation is 11.7, and our first operation here was 15.7. Good. Let's keep going. So we've seen calling a function using a predefined closure here. Here we have a predefined closure. We defined our closure on line 6. So far, so good. And let's go on to see how to call a function using a trailing closure syntax. So here, calling a function in this case, perform operation using trailing closure syntax, right? So let's stop here for a second. So when we talk about trailing closure syntax, if our function, the last, in our case here, our function, the last argument or the last parameter is a closure, which it is, we could say, hey, go ahead and use trailing closure syntax. Let's see what trailing closure syntax looks like. So we'll start out by using let result3 equal to perform operation. We'll pass in 12.1 and we'll pass in here 56.89. And here for our operation, it's the last argument, right? So here we'll use trailing closures. So go ahead and delete the argument name. So right now we have our function call, right? Our function call has one argument, second argument, right? We have num as the first argument. We have num2 as the second argument. Our third argument is a closure. We'll go ahead and use trailing closure syntax. This here is trailing closure syntax, where you have an open curly bracket and a closed curly bracket, right? So far, so good. Our function now has, again, two arguments. So we have num1, num2, right? Don't forget the in keyword. Great. So now we have num1, num2. We have access to that. We could go ahead and say return num1 times num2, right? Here we have trailing closure syntax. Before we provided the add closure, but here we are actually defining our own closure in the function call, right? So here we are defining our custom closure during the function call, right? So this is the function call. We are calling our function perform operation. We are passing it a defined closure that we defined. In that case, we're saying go ahead, instead of adding num1 and num2, go ahead and multiply num1 and num2, right? So in that case, let's actually just say 12 times 5 to keep it easier, right? So we should get 60. And let's go ahead and print result. Print result3. Right? So we indeed got 60 for our result. Here, 60.0. It's a double, right? So here, again, the difference between line 22 and line 26. Line 22, we are passing in a predefined closure, which is called add. And line 26, we are defining our own closure as we call the function. Those are two key differences here, right? If you want to have a custom closure, you pass in a trailing closure, and you go ahead and perform whatever operation you want. Here we could add also, we could multiply, we could divide, anything that gets us returning a double, right? Any operation that returns a double is satisfied here. So we could multiply, we could add, we could divide, we could subtract, right? So far, so good. So this here is a brief lightning round of closures, defining closures, calling and executing a defined closure, defining a function that takes in a closure, calling our function using a predefined closure that we did before. And lastly, we saw defining our own closure while calling a function, right? Hope that helps. I'll post some more videos on using closures. But basically, this is hands-on using a closure, introduction to closures, and what closures look like. All right. So hopefully we could see the code here. This is the code. We could go ahead and take a screenshot at this point, test it in our playgrounds. Thanks for watching.